of the organizers of this session. It's great, despite the times that we're in, to still be able to get together and even overcome some of the distances that might have separated us in the past. And so I'm really happy on behalf of the ICA to see so many of our commissions working together in this meeting. And for all of those that are attending, I hope that you're doing as well as can be expected amid the pandemic. So as Lucine introduced, my name is Robert Roth. I was asked to give a broad overview of what usability for all might mean to our commission on the user experience. And as I was researching this topic and thinking about the concepts that I want to introduce to frame discussion, I came back to this concept of inclusive design. And so we'll be asking today, what does an inclusive cartographic design look like? Quick background on our commission. The Use Commission was first established in 1984. And so here focusing on map use versus map design. So the Use Commission was established in 1984, and we've had continual commission status excepting 1999 to 2003. In 2003, we were reestablished under the purview of Corné van Elseker and refocused on usability and user-centered design versus map use. And today we have reorganized around, as Lucine said, this topic of the user experience. And I'll give a definition of user experience and how it relates to other topics related to inclusive design in a few minutes. So I was thinking about the main intervention that this group could come today, and I kept coming back to our meeting in Curitiba, Brazil. Our commission has a long history of collaborating with other commissions around kind of 1 to 2 day workshops, often after or before a different conference. And so the probably most meaningful experience I had as part of this commission was when I was vice chair and Lucine was the host in Curitiba when we held a workshop to envision the future of cartographic research. We had a collaboration with Cognitive Visualization, Geovisualization, and the Map Design Commission. And this led to a white paper, a research agenda on user studies in cartography that had broad participation across the world. You can see 11 authors, I think something like 8 unique countries. And in the paper, we discussed 2 tensions facing user studies or user research generally in cartography. The first is one I won't talk much about today. It's the difference between qualitative and quantitative research and how we are beginning to roll in or triangulate a variety of new methods for cartography. And we open talking about this tension. One that I do think is relevant to the topic of inclusive design is a second tension we were seeing between basic science and what we were calling user-centered design studies. And so here, basic science, the entire 20th century of cartography was focused on large sample sizes, simplified materials, and simple tasks with the goal of generalizability, where we could have a finding and apply it to all map designs. Today, our commission is really interested in basic science still, but also in these emerging user-centered design studies, where we're using small sample sizes, real-world materials, and complex tasks. And the idea here is to document the entire design process so that we can transfer insights to potentially similar contexts. In the paper, as we open up, we kind of talked about this as a distinction between traditional cartographic research, so focusing on quantitative studies and generalizability, and these kind of new empirics, these new user studies that are qualitative by most part and are focused on transferability. This is how I started thinking about today's topic of usability for all. In the past, in sort of the 20th century focus on communication in cartography, we were trying to study the quote unquote average map user. We would run a series of studies. Maybe we would show 2 different symbol stimuli, and we would try to characterize how the average user responds to that particular map design, to the end of reducing kind of the confusion, reducing the noise, and improving the communication. And so much of our cartographic recommendations are focused on the middle of the bell curve in terms of a scientific approach, the middle of this normal curve, right? When it comes to user-centered design studies, we're often more interested in the margins. We're often more interested in the groups that are not defined by the average, but instead trying to extend the user experience into these margins, effectively to have usability for all. And so in a lot of ways, this new paradigm, this user-centered design paradigm, is changing the focus from the average user and instead thinking about the margins. And colleagues in data feminism are saying this is the only way forward, that designers should look first at those who are in the margins, who are not included by these big generalizable scientific studies. The people pushed to the margins in any particular design context demonstrate who and what the system is trying to exclude. And arguably, by focusing on the middle point, by focusing on the average user, our own science in cartography has excluded a large number of people or pushed a large amount of our user group into the margins. And if you haven't read this, this is one of the most influential books on my thinking in recent times, Data Feminism, that is really thinking about new ways forward that are more inclusive and that treat those that are in the margin explicitly. And so as I returned to this paper and as I was thinking about my wonderful time in Curitiba, I'm really starting to think that what we set forward here is a way of both still doing that design for the average map user, but also finding new ways to engage with the margins. And this framework that we put together in the opening of the paper, I think includes room for both. One of the reasons why I'm really excited about this is that time and time again, we found that designing for the margins improves the experience for all. This is an initiative by Microsoft that I really admire called the Inclusive Design Toolkit. And their mantra is that we first need to recognize exclusion. We need to recognize that much of our science is focused on the averages and deviation from the mean, and not focused on the outliers, not focused on the margins. We also need to realize that when we solve for one, we can extend that solution to many. And I love this iconography on the right here. If you think about a mobile device, right, you want to have that mobile device be activated so you can hold it in one hand, so that all of our interactions are thumb-based, right? And of course, that is extremely important when there's a disability where you cannot use one of your arms. But situationally, we often have some sort of either temporary or situational inability to use that hand, right? You might have a temporary injury that now because you have a cast on your hand, are forced to just use the one hand again to interact with your device. Or say if you're a new parent, a context that is certainly something that often isn't considered in a very male-dominated sort of scientific approach to cartography, you exclusively are holding the child and on your phone at the same time. And so when we think about the margins and when we try to include the margins, we can start to build solutions that actually work better for everyone, that actually will allow us to make use of those maps in a variety of additional contexts. And so to me, when I might have pitched this as usability for all as this new empirics, but I think it's a way to think about both science and practice, both this sort of traditional generalizable quantitative approach and this emerging user-centered design studies. And arguably, I think a big way forward for cartography, for new research, is not just to repeat the science that we've already done over the last 50, 75 years, but to think about redesigning the study to explicitly consider the margin. Okay, so again, Lucine asked me to provide some broad introduction to some concepts. And again, I'm bending this towards our commission. I'm going to make some connections to the other commissions, but I didn't want to go too deep there. I really want to learn from the expertise in the other commissions around usability for all. So I like to start with the concept of universal usability. This was a concept that was really popular in the 80s and 90s. This idea that, as long as we consider usability, eventually every tool will be useful for everyone. And I introduced this by contrasting Google Maps and Esri's ArcGIS Pro. In terms of the total volume of time, these are probably the two most heavily used maps, interactive maps, currently available today. Google Maps, you interact with it maybe for 5 seconds at a time, but everyone in the world is using it. ArcGIS Pro, maybe there's only a couple 100,000 people working on it, but they use it every day, every second of their life, right? This is a key sort of example where trying to make a product that works for everyone actually kind of is impossible. Usability in this case describes the ease of using something. And so how transparent that interface is. And ultimately, I think everyone can use Google Maps with very little learning, right? But it doesn't do all that much. Google Maps doesn't solve a lot of the world's problems. It gets me from A to B, right? It helps me navigate to find a particular location, say in Curitiba, but it's not going to do this more in-depth spatial analysis. It's not going to have that really high-end quality cartography. I need to move to an expert system that is more useful, that has higher utility. And so this idea that every tool will work for everyone, that's to me not the way to think about design. Instead, what we want to think about inclusive design being is design that intentionally considers who the map is for. And so throughout the process, we are asking the question, who is our audience? And who isn't at the table currently? Who are we not considering? And sometimes because many people aren't interested in learning the overhead of ArcGIS Pro, it's okay that the tool doesn't work for them. But we want to make sure that we're not excluding other components, dimensions of our potential user group. And so here, this is a classic way that we think about the user experience design. So in order to have an experience, a user experience with maps, you have the map. And of course, you have the users, right? And the user here will define as the intended audience of the map product. And our commission tends to use the term user over audience because we're assuming interactivity and customization. Customization being a key way that you can include in this case. And so user audience, kind of the same term, but user seems more active and in control of their experience. And so the user experience is driven by interaction with the map. And that interaction can be just visual, but more often than not, it's supported, right, by some digital device that's enabling us to change the map, right? And so ultimately, the user experience is driven by a dialogue, a conversation. The user requests something, the map changes and then provides new information. The user then understands something new about the map, so the user itself also has changed, and that continues these loops, this conversation. So a key distinction in UX design is that humans experience interactions. But we use interfaces. Interfaces are tools. And so we're much less interested just in what might be called UI design. Instead, we're interested in how do we design that experience, right? And so in order to design the experience, you can see we can't just be locked down and thinking about the map itself. We need to be understanding the user. It's this dialogue, this continuum. We're trying to design that experience. And so for a formal definition from our commission, UX design and map design in this case is the iterative and intentional. And so again, intentional being important. Design decisions that lead to a successful outcome with a map product, as well as a satisfying, productive, and inclusive process while arriving at the outcome, right? The journey is as important as the destination in a lot of ways when it comes to user experience design. But again, it forces us, it demands us to be thinking about our users. And so to go back to this term, we might say that we could have called today's topic UX for all, with usability just being one side of that usability utility trade-off. We're trying to thread the needle to support that user experience, that productive dialogue. So I've already mentioned this, but the dialogue between the user and map often is mediated by a computing device. And so here I have a very old school computing device. This is from my dissertation a decade ago. I don't know how I got so old. Today it would be looking like something like this, like a smartphone. But either way, it's some sort of digital device now often is that intermediary. And this is where we get into a topic of accessibility. The computing device often either affords or limits our ability to obtain and benefit from or interact with the map product. And so because we now have often a digital and a mobile first design context, the access to that technology often is a key constraint that excludes particular groups or particular audiences. And I mentioned I don't want to talk too much about some kind of the purview of our other commissions, but I thought I at least needed to mention in my own country, we have something called 508 compliance. This is an amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that requires all of our American federal agencies to make their digital information technologies accessible to people with disabilities. And this is primarily focused on the subset of our user group that are blind, that have low sightedness, that have some sort of other visual impairment. And you can see there's a number of other countries that have other types of internal laws that require, that demand this type of accessibility compliance. We do well in some of these areas as cartographers. I would say that we probably have the best research right now on color and contrast. So thinking about, say, Cindy Brewer's work on designing for color schemes for the color vision deficient, different contrast studies that have been completed across different visual variables. I think there is still a lot of research, though, in this area. In our own world, in interactivity, keyboard navigation often is default. So if you use any of the, the Esri, the Mapbox, or the open source, so Leaflet, D3, you're getting keyboard navigation directly out of the box, anything that's mobile first. So we do well here, but we often don't do well in the other areas. And so how do we, say, translate an interactive map, the current view, so that a screen reader can access it, right? How do we put an alternative text on something that's explicitly dynamic, a web map, right? How do we automatically generate place-based captions and transcripts? These are things that we don't do very well now that would help support accessibility for visual impairment. And these are things, again, that our technology can help us with, right? And so the intermediary, whatever a smartphone or a computer, is something that can actually improve the inclusiveness, but also because of a digital divide, not everyone in the world has one of these devices. And so again, that then might promote exclusiveness. So we've talked about UX design. I want to introduce the topic of design itself because we're often interested in the design process in the UX Commission. And so when I introduce design to my students, I love to introduce this diagram. This is one of my favorite figures. It's just, to me, so relatable, so compelling, called the design squiggle. When my students have to identify a final project topic, it's what they're doing right now in my classes, they struggle at first, especially their first time, because it's the opportunities, the possibilities are boundless. They can make a map of any topic anywhere in the world, right? And their minds are going in all sorts of different directions, right? Somewhere in the middle of that design process, they begin to start to formulate or crystallize their design idea. And once you've gotten that design sort of vision in place, that's when you can execute. And so if this is a timeline from the beginning of the process to the end, often our design is highly iterative early on. And I tell students that half of the work you're going to do in this class is not with ArcGIS Pro. It's with research, and it's with trying to find data that actually is going to help tell that story. Seasoned cartographers will try to simplify or streamline this design squiggle into a set of cycles. And so that in order to try to have milestones or deadlines, we'll have what are called development cycles or design cycles, where we will think about the concept and then implement, and then reconsider the concept, and then implement something new, and so on. But the design, the squiggle part, coming first. Unfortunately, in practice, we often get the squiggle backwards. And my students do this as well, where they think they're going to map one thing, but then realize, well, actually that map, it doesn't need to be a map. And then at the very last second, they start grabbing at various other ideas, right? This is often how many cartographic firms, especially startups, unfortunately work, where they implement something quickly. They get a minimum viable product available and then realize that it doesn't quite work for various reasons. And so they start to revise. And with each cycle, they're revising and they're adding more functional scope. They're laying on new features, new different data sets, whatever. Until the end, they've completely lost their design. Right? They are essentially have no vision in this case. And this leads me to come back to the bell curve. These cycles of development often occur in order to react to this really famous tech model called the Rogers adoption curve. This is a model of how new design or technology innovation reaches its users. And I'll preface this, it's a highly problematic model. But if you are in a computer science program, you're likely to be taught that you are the innovator. And so you have this brilliant design, so you effectively are on the margin, right? You are always going to get an early set of adopters. And so there's always going to be a group of people who are really tech savvy, are interested in new designs, and will immediately adopt your technology. The difficult part then in the next design cycle is reaching the early majority. And so the focus of the Roger adoption curve is, again, on the middle of the bell curve. How through these different cycles can we first pacify the early majority and then activate a late majority? And to Rogers, this kind of classic model, essentially they would say, don't worry about the margin. Don't worry about the laggards. They're never going to adopt your technology anyway. And so you're trying to get at the middle. In a business standpoint, you're trying to get at the largest possible user group, right? But again, what that does is it leaves people behind. And it also it comes from a design standpoint where the innovator seems to be the first user. But you are not, the designer is not the user of the product. And your stakeholders, your early adopters, are not the user of the product. And so what this type of thinking actually does, where we keep implementing and then we say, what features does the early majority want? So we'll implement those. Which one's the late majority? We lose the entire margin. And I love the inverted squiggle here because this is, to me, where all the fun stuff is. The squiggle is the creative part of cartography. It's finding those unique, customized. This type of a model, we lose the margin and we ultimately exclude. And so our commission has promulgated an alternative model that includes user evaluation early and often in the process. We call this a user-centered design process, where we have iterative and intentional designs that include users throughout. And we often say it's better to focus on formative versus summative studies. So formative being early in the design process, summative being late. Often at the very end, all you can really learn is if it worked or not. And then if it didn't work, well, you just spent 6 months developing this mobile app. You really can't go back at that point, right? Also, really emphasize beginning design before you draw any interface, before you collect any data, to conduct a needs assessment. This is something that my mentor, Corné van Elseker, always talked about is really important, is to understand the user's tasks, what they want to be doing, how their current tools are not supporting their needs, and then to use that to define the user group, right? And so here we often, in user-centered design, would say, okay, this is helping us partition. We know that we're going to not be including maybe a general audience because we're focused on specialists. Maybe we're trying to target a general audience, so we're not going to be focusing on specialists. This is a stage, I would argue, that we can really think about who we are excluding, not just that classic specialist general audience dichotomy, but who might we be thinking, who might we be excluding in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of culture, religion, in terms of language. thinking about in terms of visual impairment, accessibility, all these additional ways that we might be inadvertently excluding. And so one of the things that we're thinking through in my lab at Wisconsin is how can we make the design process more participatory? And I have to give a shout out to Megan Kelly, one of our senior PhD students, who's writing a fantastic dissertation, actually defending it next week. We're very, very proud of her, where she's seeking ways to have a greater degree of user participation, and in particular thinking about how organizers and partners are not the actual users, how to make, in this case, the green line have a larger amount of participation throughout the process. And so modifying our traditional user-centered design process for greater amounts of participation. Okay, so I mentioned that Lucy mentioned that I'm the chair of the UX Commission. I also have been working with Menoyan Kroc and Britta Ricker through the ICA on a special initiative to produce a textbook on mapping the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. If you were at the ICA in Tokyo, Ayako Kagawa, one of our co-authors, gave a keynote talking about the emerging relationship between the UN and the ICA, one that I see offering cartographers a really great way forward to help with these sustainable development goals. As part of this, we wrote a chapter section. So here's a little sneak preview. We want this to be available ahead of the holiday, so it'll be in everyone's stockings ahead of the holiday. It's almost done. But here's a quick preview of how we're talking about audiences. And so again, audiences is maybe more broad, where it'd be both static and interactive, but essentially users in this case. And our focus here is on individual differences. And we try to put together a checklist or a rubric, an analytic tool to help us think through, are we being inclusive? And what we focused on so far in my discussion was really on accessibility. So different barriers to obtaining and benefiting from the map. And so participation, visual impairment, disability, and that digital divide. So even though our technology can help promote inclusion, it's still not everyone has access to that technology. We then bring in some other dimensions of inclusion that come from our history of science and cartography. So looking at different characteristics of expertise or the learned knowledge, enhancing abilities for using the map, our skills, so specific knowledge areas for using the map acquired through expertise, and one that I've always found to be really important, motivation. How do we get, say, our students versus a general audience versus a specialist to actually care about using this map? How do we promote buy-in? So I want to take, it looks like I have maybe about 11 minutes left. I want to take the remainder of time to just sort of quickly apply this analytic to a few projects that we've developed in the University of Wisconsin Cartography Lab. Okay, the first interactive that's no longer online, unfortunately, so I have a little bit of an older screenshot, but one that that I really learned a lot from was the Bad River Watershed Wikimap. This was a tool developed by a former PhD student of mine, Carl Sack, that allowed for residents of the River Watershed to contribute data. And there's a couple unique contexts here. One, the Bad River, it's a river in the state of Wisconsin, so in the United States, that is also runs through a Native American reservation. And so a key part of this study was how to bring the voices from this indigenous community to a more public sort of perception. Second, upstream is an iron ore mountain. You can maybe see slightly the ridge here, that there was a proposal for an open pit mine. Open pit mining is disastrous for the environment. And because it's upstream to the reservation, there were environmental concerns that actually a lot of the sustainable harvesting, there's a lot of rice paddies, a lot of berry harvesting, hunting gathering in this location would actually be decimated by the mining. And so Carl developed this wiki map to allow both citizens in the area and also folks from the reservation to contribute additional values. So each one of these circles is a point that has been added to the map, and then with a code on some sort of non-economic value. Because of course, the argument is this is going to bring a great economic boom to the community, but at the cost of recreation, aesthetics, wildlife, biodiversity, historic and spiritual value, and so on. And so Carl enacted a 6-stage, just like as we introduced, a 6-stage user-centered design process. And as part of that, he worked in the reservation to bring computing technology to the indigenous community. And so this is one of the traditional difficulties of overcoming the digital divide, right? So bringing this technology and actually offering technology training so that the community could make use of this tool, but also to make use of computing technology to advocate for themselves in multiple other ways moving forward. And so here we have Carl working on the Bad River Reservation. And this work actually produced a series of maps that helped articulate all of these non-economic values in the reservation. And the map actually went to the state government. I'm very happy to say that Carl, as kind of a scholar activist, was able to use his tools and the data sets he's created to advocate against the mine. And the mine actually never was given a permit because of these concerns. And so this is a great way where maybe we weren't thinking about participation and how maps can facilitate participation and dialogue in the same way. You can see here, if the economic value is along the ridge, all of the destruction that might occur downstream and aggregates as we get closer and closer to Lake Superior. So let's take our inclusive analytic here and see in what ways was Carl's work actively and intentionally inclusive. Well, absolutely, Carl was focused on participation, trying to bring community members and folks from the organization into the design, and actively trying to get across, overcome that digital divide. Carl was also really focused on education, and so trying to make sure that folks with lower educational status were not left out of the design process and of using the map. And in the skills he helped develop, we're really focused on computing technology. And so how to use web browsers, how to use modern web maps as a way then to be able to contribute information. And we would argue that the motivation here was need, that this area was about to be devastated by this open pit mine. And so we were able to think about how need helped promote buy-in in this project. A great project. It's available open source online if you're interested. The second project that I want to talk about is Global Madison. This is actually a tool that I presented at the ICA in Brazil. And so this tool, the premise is to use the streets of Madison as a global classroom. I'll pause for a second here. But students go on a walking tour, a guided tour essentially. These are Geography 101 students, so often their first geography class. In the United States, we are famously terrible at teaching geography. And so 101 often our students' first exposure to geography.
Hello, my name is Stephen Young.
So here's my colleague, Stephen Young, the professor of this course that I worked with to develop the tool. One thing to note is that we designed it because it's an educational tool. We had to design it for individuals that were visually impaired and for individuals with some sort of physical handicap that could not actually walk through the environment. And so we designed this around sort of this podcast idea that students could listen, or also read as they approach these locations. And so we had this, the entire map content essentially available for reading. And so when we show up to a particular location, you can look at the image. There's alt text for each of these images. There's also a downloadable assignment that you can get on digital products. So if you don't have a data plan, there are printable sheets that replicate this design. And so trying to think through how to make this tool as accessible as possible because it was an educational tool. And so we go all through the isthmus and see essentially how local places are impacted by global processes, by globalization. And so we ran a series of studies, again, ran a user-centered process for designing this tool, and looked at where people got lost. We thought this was going to be an interesting wayfinding question. But one thing that we actually found was more fascinating was the feedback on where students found parts of the route unsafe. And when we started digging deeper in this safety, some of these were crossings, but other of these locations that were unsafe actually had poor lighting. And so as a white male, I move very comfortably through the landscape of Madison. It's a town, but it's not very large, 250,000 people. Our students, though, that were female felt very uncomfortable in certain locations we had included on this map. By running these studies, we were able to break from our experiences, my own experiences, and understand a different layer of safety issues that were really important ultimately to the design of this tool. And so again, to come back to our analytic, for accessibility, we had student participation. We were very much focused on visual impairment, and so having everything be text-driven in addition to map-driven. We were thinking about disability, so we had this actually be responsive so that students could still complete it from home if they were unable to walk in the landscape. We were focused on education, but here spatial thinking skills, geographic skills, and trying to think of ways to really stimulate students' interests. Okay, so two ways that we might use this framework of inclusion as an assessment of the success of our tools. The minute I have left, I want to just provide some broad take-homes. First, we need to consider who is and who is not at the table throughout design. And again, remember that designers, so you, the cartographers, are not users, stakeholders are not users. User-centered design demands inclusion. We also want to be designing from the margins, as consideration of individual differences leads to more robust experiences for all. Designing from the margins benefits also both science and practice, and I can imagine our commissions coming together with a research agenda to rethink, to essentially replicate many of those classic cartography papers for the margins. Third, we want to evaluate success by inclusiveness and this word I keep using, intentionality, or in addition to usability and utility. And what I've covered, accessibility, expertise, skills, motivation, just a starting point for inclusion, and do not capture cultural, ethnic, geographic, political, religious, and other socio-demographic considerations, all things that need to be part of that needs assessment. And so moving forward, I really believe we should reproduce the cartographic canon to consider individual differences rather than an imagined average map user. And in doing so, we need to question that objectivity in neutrality in our generalizable and transferable user studies. So who's missing? We also need to define the meaning of accessibility for cartographic design and set that research agenda for accessible design of interactive, online, and mobile maps. And to me, accessibility, that's one thing that it's legally mandated in many of our countries, but it's something that we are falling short in terms of a discipline in having answers. So to me, this is an important first step towards inclusive cartographic design. Finally, we want to identify ways to build participation more completely into the user design workflows to fully realize this inclusive design. And this is also, we'll have to question some extractive dimensions of the user-centered design process as a way to ownership and control. So please visit our commission website. You can see here we have the link to today's meeting. We're happy to add you to our commission listserv. Just contact Lucine or myself. And with that, I will pass the baton to our next speaker. Thank you for your attention.